Welcome back to EMR 6480, Qualitative Research. I am your host, Dr. June Gothberg, and today I would like to talk a little bit about conceptual frameworks. So what is a conceptual framework? We talk about this a lot when we're talking about research studies. We get pretty deep into this when we are putting together qualitative research. At its simplest form, a conceptual framework is a visual description or a mapping of your research study. A conceptual framework is used to illustrate what you expect to find through your research, including, in this very quantitative term, how the variables you're considering might relate to each other. So a conceptual framework can be used in quantitative as well as qualitative studies. A conceptual framework represents the researcher's synthesis of literature on how to explain a phenomenon. It maps out all the actions required given previous observations on the subject of research. Finally, the conceptual framework sets that stage for the presentation of the particular research question that drives the investigation being reported based on the problem statement. So that conceptual framework should tie all these pieces together. It should illustrate all the pieces of your research design. So here is just a really short synopsis. A conceptual framework is that visual representation of your study. It could be an image, it could be a graphic, it could be a chart. What it does is it explains those key concepts, the assumptions, expectations, those relationships between your concepts, your ideas, theories that support and frame your research. Along with this visualization, you should include a written walkthrough explaining that conceptual framework. This tends to be done best in 1 to 3 paragraphs. So there's 2 basic types of conceptual frameworks. One is a process framework, which relates to the how. It sets the stage and it walks the viewer from the initiation to the conclusion of your research project. The other type of conceptual framework is a content framework. It relates to the why. It sets out those variables of interest, it frames up possible relationships, and it might also show the strength of those relationships. So what are the steps to creating a conceptual framework? Well, first, you need to choose your topic. You need to decide on what will your research topic be. Next, you would do a literature review. Review the relevant and I'm always pushing you that up-to-date research on the topic using peer-reviewed literature. For qualitative, you may also need to comb the literature on your methodology and your methods as well. For instance, a conceptual framework for grounded theory is based on the process of conducting grounded theory, not on the variables, concepts, or existing theories. Your next step is to isolate those important variables, concepts, and/or theories. Identify the specifics related to your topic of interest and describe how are they related. Help the visualizer, the reader, to understand how these components are related to your research topic and that question. The 4th step is to generate the conceptual framework. Build your conceptual framework using your mix of the variables, concepts, theories, methodology, methods from peer-reviewed articles that you have read. Your problem statement should serve as a reference in constructing that conceptual framework. In effect, your study will attempt to answer a question that other researchers have not explained yet. Your research should address a knowledge gap. The other approach that you can take, and is especially important in qualitative research, is you may want to approach a study that takes a study that has already been conducted and conducting that study in a different context. This helps us build a foundation that can eventually lead to more generalizable topics, more generalizable findings in the qualitative research world. So what do you do for the assignment for a conceptual framework? Well, I always try to help you think about this as this should be a tool so that the reader can very easily understand your framework for your research study. So I advise to keep it simple. Create a visual of your framework and then be able to explain the entire framework in 1 to 2 paragraphs. You need to explain it well enough so somebody else could pick it up and implement it, but not to so much detail that they get lost in the different things that you're trying to present. So you're trying to convey your research proposal, your prospectus, through visualization. You want to make sure that a person that is not familiar with your study will understand what you're proposing by looking at that framework and the short description. I've included some examples from the literature. Here is a study, a 2018 study, and it looked at the impact of critical illness news, so getting that news, on the family. And this particular study used a hermeneutic phenomenological study. So you can look at this and the first thing that you see in that upper left-hand corner is this idea of getting that news, of a family member getting that news. And the 3 areas of interest for this research study is how does the family take the unexpected? How do they experience the pronouncement of death? And what is the impact of that news on self-caring? I've shown you here a second visualization that they put together that highlights how these are interconnected. So you can see that the researchers were looking for the physical and emotional impact, the unstable conditions, and the context and unknown and disturbing. Here's another example from the literature, quite a different looking conceptual framework. And this was from a 2016 study that looked at building a framework for theory-based ethnographies for studying intergenerational family food practices. So looking at those different generations and what are those family food practices. You can see they went to the literature, they looked for the social and cultural meaning in the system, they looked at the economic background, those cultural schemes, you're looking from the bottom and moving up, and you can see the factors that play into this practices of the food experience. And then ultimately these researchers were looking for that to better understand childhood obesity. I've also given you a couple of student examples. So this first one is a preliminary conceptual framework for a phenomenological study that demonstrates the cycle of how African American male doctoral students at a predominantly white institution are confronted by a number of barriers fueled by these racial stereotypes that influence the psychological, social, and academic experiences. So this particular student created a visualization of this framework that is in a circular frame showing that this is a cycle that that tends to continue. This was pulled from the literature and used as a framing for what they were going to do in their interviews with African American male doctoral students. Here is a second student example of a conceptual framework, and this student was looking at a US law called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And in that law, there was outlined pre-employment skills that were needed to be taught to students with disabilities to help them in that transition from high school into post-secondary opportunities. You can see here, so this is a qualitative look at this policy and the experiences these students had with these policies and how it led to a successful process and ultimately employment. So as you look at that, you can see the linear pathway across that this particular student was interested in studying. This particular conceptual framework looks at a process conceptual framework because it was a grounded theory. So the student was able to identify that there was a gap in knowledge, understanding, and skills of effective interactions between teachers and students used to increase success of students dealing with trauma and involved in traumatic events. What the student was looking for in conducting this grounded theory was to produce a theory of nature of interactions that are used to increase student success with dealing with trauma. And so you can see the process here. The process was the student was going to interview a teacher, create field notes, do some open coding, come up with some themes. Do an interview with a second teacher, again create field notes, conduct open coding, compare what they found with the interview with teacher 2 to the interview with teacher 1 to come up with some of those key ideas. Then take all of that knowledge moving into interview 3 and again creating field notes, conducting open coding, and comparing interview 3 with interview 1 and 2 to find those themes. This process in grounded theory is called constant comparison. So this is a process conceptual framework. Finally, for this last one, here is a conceptual framework, and the student was interested in studying the life stories of dreamers. And what that narrative study looked at was how these dreamers at a Midwestern university, how they experienced resilience in the process of overcoming the negative effects of being a dreamer in a higher education institute of higher ed. And you can see here, because it's a narrative, what this study is looking for are what are those early life social challenges. Then in the middle of the story, how was the decision made to attend higher education? What was the students' experiences in regard to support, financial and legal? And then once they made it into the Institute of Higher Ed, this is like beginning, middle, and end of a narrative. The story of these students was, what was the life experience once the student attended this higher education institute? So that is a pretty brief overview of developing a conceptual theory, and I hope it will help you as you are designing and defining your qualitative research prospectus.